The steam from my coffee mug curled into the crisp morning air as I leaned back in my Uncle Nathan's old porch chair, letting the silence of the meadow settle around me. It had been 3 weeks since I inherited this cabin. 3 weeks of learning the rhythms of a quieter life. Mist rising from the grass, the soft creak of wood under my boots. The sound of wind moving over cedar logs weathered since the 1970s. This land had been in my family for decades, and though the cabin's edges carried a rustic roughness, it felt deeply mine. I remember thinking how good the morning was shaping up, right up until the SUVs arrived. At first I thought I was imagining the rumble, but soon headlights cut through the mist like intruders on a stage play. 3 glossy SUVs rolled into my drive in formation, amber lights flashing like some low-budget police raid, tires crunching on the gravel. I nearly spilled my coffee. For a second, genuine doubt flashed through my mind. Law enforcement? Emergency crew? But as the first door swung open, my confusion warped into disbelief. A woman in her 40s stepped out, her hair pulled into a tight bun, blazer sharp enough to look corporate, clipboard clutched like it was her badge of office. Behind her, a man in a reflective vest with a shiny security-style badge clipped to it emerged, already unspooling yellow caution tape as though my 5-acre meadow were a crime scene. Another volunteer pulled cones from the back and began assembling what looked absurdly like a traffic checkpoint. The whole scene played less like real enforcement and more like suburban cosplay. Still, the performance rattled me, mostly because they acted with such unshakable certainty. The woman marched up my steps without hesitation. "Sir, I'm Malene Pierce, chairwoman of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association," she declared briskly. Her voice had the firm pitch of someone used to winning arguments before they even began. "We've received reports of unauthorized occupation. We're here to conduct a compliance inspection." Unauthorized occupation? I blinked, then laughed in disbelief, almost choking on my coffee. This cabin was my Uncle Nathan Carter's. He passed away last month. I inherited it fair and square, deed registered with the county 3 weeks ago. My words didn't slow them down. While Malene pressed forward with her clipboard, the man in the vest, she called him Derek, was stringing caution tape between my trees, wrapping bright yellow across my driveway like he was staging an official lockdown. The amber strobes from the idling SUVs flickered across the porch, reflecting off my coffee cup, warping an ordinary moment into surreal theater. "That's what we're here to determine," Malene sniffed, tapping her clipboard. "This property has been flagged for violations. Derek here is a certified compliance volunteer with authority to inspect any property under HOA jurisdiction." She spoke the word jurisdiction as though it granted her a sheriff's star. I rose from Nathan's chair, planting my boots firmly on the porch boards. "With respect, unless Derek here has an actual badge issued by the county, you're trespassing. Volunteers don't get to play cop on private land." Derek's hand twitched toward his badge, but his eyes betrayed him. "Real law enforcement never fidgets when asked for credentials." He looked exactly like someone realizing his prop wasn't going to survive close scrutiny. Malene, perhaps sensing her volunteer's nerves, leaned closer and jabbed her pen toward me. "These inspections are for community safety. Non-compliance will escalate to further action by appropriate authorities." "Which authorities?" I shot back, pulling my phone from my pocket and hitting record. The lens caught Derek wrapping up his cones, Malene clutching papers designed to look official but already smudged where the ink bled through. And worst of all, one of their signs hammered right into my property marker, "Chairwoman Reserved Parking." My pulse spiked. They hadn't just trespassed, they were branding my land as theirs. The camera didn't lie. "So let me get this straight," I narrated into the phone. "You're conducting an inspection without a warrant, with a volunteer who won't show ID, and you've already staked silly parking signs on property you don't own." Malene's eyes darted nervously at Derek, who fumbled with his radio like a rookie catch playing police drama. In the distance beyond the trees, I noticed another SUV idling, like backup for their play acting. And just when the situation couldn't look more ridiculous, a neighbor's pickup slowed along the road. Rebecca Shaw, who I'd met briefly when I first viewed the cabin, rolled down her window holding what looked like an HOA receipt in her hand. "Nate, what on earth is going on? What's with the lights and tape?" "Apparently," I said loud enough for them all to hear, "this is an HOA inspection by volunteers, without actual credentials." Rebecca squinted at Derek's cones and shook her head knowingly. "Landscaping fees, patrols, it's all theater. she muttered almost to herself. Recognition crossed her face, not surprise. So this wasn't the first time. Within minutes, Malene realized her little raid was unraveling in front of witnesses. Her tone cracked. "All right, Mr. Carter. You'll receive a compliance report within 48 hours. Failure to cooperate will escalate further." She shoved a flimsy document toward me, pages rattling in the morning air. Then she snapped at Derek to pack up. And just like that, the caravan of wannabe enforcers retreated, amber lights sweeping across my porch as if making one final attempt at intimidation. But the silence they left behind felt very different than before. My land hadn't just been challenged. It had been claimed artificially with props and performance. For the first time since I moved in, I understood exactly what I was up against. This wasn't about grass height or mailboxes. This was about people confusing theater with authority. And if there's one thing my Uncle Nathan had always said about bullies, it was this: they only win as long as nobody calls out the act. 2 hours after the convoy of SUVs had rolled out of my driveway, the real harassment began. My moving truck finally arrived, its music thumping faintly through the cab as the driver, Tom, hopped down with a clipboard. But before either of us could start unloading, he frowned. Parked sideways across the gravel drive was the same black SUV I'd seen earlier, now abandoned, blocking access like an improvised barricade. "Time's ticking, buddy," Tom muttered, tapping his watch. "I get charged overtime if we sit like this." It was absurd. Less than a day in my new cabin, and it felt like I was trapped in one of my uncle's old war stories. Except the aggressor wasn't a foreign army, but an HOA with amber lights and clipboards. Scanning the property, I caught sight of a figure slipping behind a cluster of oaks about 60 yards off. Malene Pierce herself. She wasn't marching with the same bluster as before. She was crouching, watching a suburbia version of a spy. Her blazer stood out against the green meadow, but every time I looked her way, she ducked lower like we were playing some ridiculous game of hide-and-seek. The coffee from that morning churned in my stomach as I realized this wasn't a performance anymore. She was surveilling me. I walked the perimeter under the wide Texas sun, pretending to inspect fence posts, but in truth I was running a test. Every time I changed direction, Malene shifted too, toward the trees when I moved back meadow, toward the parked SUV when I edged closer to the road. It was almost comical, except it was also terrifying. You don't expect to inherit harassment along with land. And yet here I was, hunted on my uncle's soil by volunteers trying to look official. That's when I found them. Near the pump house, a squat stone and timber structure my uncle had built years ago, a small wooden box leaned against the wall. Inside, dangling from a rusted nail, were 3 old brass keys taped together with a strip of masking tape and labeled simply, "Facilities Access." My pulse quickened. Facilities. My Uncle Nathan had mentioned in one of his letters that he sometimes leased a section of undeveloped land to the HOA for use. At the time, I'd brushed it off as neighborly generosity. Now, in light of today's strange parade, I suspected more. The pump house lock resisted like it hadn't been turned in a while, but after wrestling the key with a twist and a curse, the pad snapped open. The door creaked into a space far more organized than I expected. Pipes lined the walls, electrical conduits neatly strung, fresh labeling and marker on valves and switches. Someone had tended this recently, and I doubted it was my uncle, who had been in assisted living for 2 years. What grabbed me most wasn't the plumbing, but the dull salmon-colored file cabinet tucked into the far corner. Its drawer stuck halfway before another rusted key persuaded it open. Inside lay stacks of paper bearing official county letterhead. Lease agreements. Dozens of them. Each signed by Nathan Carter and countersigned by none other than Malene Pierce. I skimmed lines under the fluorescent daylight streaming through the lone window. The agreements were clear. The HOA was leasing the pump house and mailbox cluster from Nathan, with specific terms, automatic renewals, and clauses related to maintenance fees. Which meant the HOA's jurisdiction wasn't ownership. It was tenancy. They'd been paying rent to use my family's structures, and now I'd inherited not just the cabin, but the landlord role they desperately wanted to bury. From outside, a faint crackle of radio static interrupted my stunned reading. A flat voice, "Keep watching him. Document everything he touches. We need to know if he finds it." My heart slammed against my chest. They weren't just spying casually. They had comms. This was coordinated. In broad daylight on my own deeded land, I was being surveilled like a suspect in the very building the HOA was renting from me. When I emerged, files tucked under my arm, Malene was gone from her original hiding spot. 50 yards away, though, I caught her again at the edge of brush, kneeling low, eyes fixed. I lifted a hand in mock salute, and I swear her blazer all but disappeared as she ducked so fast she nearly face-planted into the grass. Back at the house, I spread the documents across my uncle's table the way he must have once spread mail or chess pieces. Rays of afternoon sun lit the papers like evidence under interrogation lamps. The more I paged through, the clearer the picture became. Lease payments signed monthly, facility fees, and stacked in between, invoices for surveillance gear, radios, amber strobes, signage, reflective vests. None of it sanctioned by the board, all of it bearing Malene's signature. The HOA hadn't just exceeded its budget, it had blown past it, layering fake patrol programs and charging residents for equipment never authorized. Rebecca Shaw's voice echoed in my memory of that morning, muttering about landscaping fees and patrol expenses. She knew something wasn't right, and thanks to her role as treasurer, she might know exactly where the financial bodies were buried. Grant Morgan, too, the neighbor with the golden retriever who walked the roads daily. He'd already commented suspiciously on tactical comms. Slowly, I realized I wasn't isolated. There were others paying attention, others who might side with truth once it was laid bare. As afternoon shadows stretched across the meadow, I sat back in the same porch chair where the morning had begun. My uncle's pipe still rested on the shelf beside me, cold but comforting. I whispered to the woods, to Nathan himself. "You left me a fight you never finished, didn't you?" The yellow tape was gone, the SUVs silent now, but in their place stretched something more insidious. Systematic fraud, recorded in black and white in my hands. They thought intimidation would scare me. But intimidation without authority was just noise. And tomorrow, with Rebecca and Grant at my side, I'd start turning that noise into evidence. The morning after I found those lease agreements in the pump house, Rebecca Shaw pulled into my drive with a folder thick enough to choke a filing cabinet. She looked around carefully as if expecting Malene and her compliance patrol to burst out from behind the trees again, then walked briskly up to the porch. "I brought numbers," she said simply, setting the folder down on the old cedar table by the window. I poured her some coffee, and together we started going line by line. What she showed me confirmed exactly what I suspected. The Riverside Meadows HOA had become a funnel for unauthorized spending. "These line items don't add up," she explained, pointing her neatly penciled nails at the spreadsheets. Twice a month, Malene approved payments for compliance patrol safety expenses, $400 here, $600 there, without a single board vote approving the budget. Sometimes the funds went to suppliers that don't even exist, at least not in the county registry. She paged forward, showing red circled highlights. "And then there's this $2,500 charge for radio equipment. It's marked as board approved. Problem is, I was the treasurer present at that meeting. No such vote ever happened." Hearing it in her voice carried more weight than just seeing invoices. Rebecca wasn't some outsider angry over a fine. She was the treasurer inside the system, and she was confirming that the spending trail was forged. I pulled out the lease documents I found in the pump house's cabinet, spreading them alongside her spreadsheets. These prove the HOA was renting the pump house and mailbox station from my uncle. Malene has been claiming HOA ownership, but in reality she enabled all this spying equipment through property she didn't even own. Rebecca blinked, then laughed once without humor. "So she's bleeding residents dry over fake expenses and operating out of a rented shed she didn't disclose? Unbelievable." Right about then, Grant Morgan arrived, his golden retriever bounding ahead before flopping onto my porch like he owned the place. Grant carried a digital recorder in his palm. "Morning walk picked up some interesting chatter," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He set the device on the table and hit play. Static gave way to clipped radio exchanges. "Keep watching the Carter property. Document everything. He found the keys yesterday. We need to control what he uncovers." A crackle, some muttered responses. Then another. "Protocol requires escalation if he opens the cabinet." Rebecca's eyes widened as we all heard the words fall clearly under the Texas sun filtering through the window. Grant leaned back, folding his arms. I don't usually eavesdrop, but when people broadcast like wannabe cops on open frequencies, that's their problem. Piece by piece, it clicked. Maline's HOA wasn't just guilty of financial sloppiness. It had operated an unauthorized surveillance program on private citizens, funded by dues money diverted without approval, out of facilities never owned by them. My uncle had known exactly what was happening. His letters proved he'd resisted their encroachments for years. But in his last few months, as his health slipped, they escalated, trying to cement their little private patrol empire. And when I inherited the cabin, they assumed intimidation would scare me off just like they'd scared others. Rebecca shuffled papers with force now, her voice rising. They've spent over $6,000 in 8 months on nothing but fake compliance gear. And you want to know the kicker? They've been disguising these bills as landscaping improvements. She held up the proof. Invoices for equipment labeled innocently as grounds upkeep or beautification. In reality, orange cones, reflective vests, radios, and strobe lights. Residents assumed they were just paying a little more to mow the walkway. Meanwhile, we were bankrolling Maline's fantasy police force. For the first time in days, I felt anger soften into something stronger. Resolve. These weren't just sloppy neighbors. These were people who had weaponized bureaucracy and intimidation as cover for theft. And now, sitting in daylight with proof splayed across the table, we were connecting dots faster than they could erase them. I looked at Rebecca and Grant. If the community could see this, if they knew their dues were paying for radios and fake badges instead of real maintenance, everything changes. Grant whistled low, his dog thumping its tail. The trick is making sure the whole thing hits in one swing. Don't give them time to twist the narrative? Rebecca nodded sharply. She hides behind authority language. Escalations, compliance, jurisdiction. But none of it stands when residents see invoices for tents and sheriff-style radios disguised as gardening contracts. I leaned forward, pressing my palm against the table. Then we time it right. She thrives on theater, so we'll drag the theater into the spotlight. Except this time it won't be her stage. The sun had shifted higher, dappling across my uncle's furniture like quiet confirmation. Between Rebecca's figures, Grant's recordings, and the county documents, we were holding more than circumstantial suspicion. We were holding receipts, signatures, broadcast voice evidence, and property deeds. For the first time since their amber lights rolled down my drive, I didn't feel outnumbered. I felt like we had the script, and Maline's performance as chairwoman sheriff was about to collapse under its own lies. By the time Thursday afternoon rolled around, the weight of evidence we had gathered felt like kindling waiting for a single match. Rebecca had her spreadsheets of unauthorized spending highlighted in cruel red ink. Grant had recordings of radio chatter where HOA volunteers casually discussed monitoring residents, and I had county lease. Agreements proving beyond doubt that the pump house and mailbox cluster sat on my land. All that was left was the performance, and this time I'd make sure it ended with an audience that mattered. So I called Deputy Mark Lewis, a sheriff's deputy I'd been told handled rural property disputes. His calm voice on the phone provided exactly what I needed. Assurance that if these people thought intimidation and fake badges gave them power, the law would show them otherwise. The stage set itself almost too easily. I knew the HOA would bite the bait if I looked like I was conducting unauthorized activity around the pump house. Early afternoon sunlight hung high when I walked out with a clipboard and measuring tape, deliberately obvious as I paced around the building. I even jotted notes dramatically, pretending to map pipes. By 1:30, the trap snapped shut. Derek's SUV rolled onto the meadow again, amber lights flicking defiantly. Out came Derek in his reflective vest, followed by another volunteer lugging radios and folding tables. Minutes later, Maline's silver SUV pulled up, parking at the line of trees where she so often positioned herself to direct from the shadows. I could see her tapping her phone, eyes darting nervously between me and Derek as if instructing his next lines. Soon enough, the amber strobes were flashing. Cones were placed and a makeshift command post was set right on my boundary marker, their theater stage set under full daylight. Deputy Lewis arrived exactly on time, his county-marked SUV unmistakable with blue decals glinting in the sun. In contrast to Derek's jittery bravado, Lewis stepped out in crisp uniform, badge brightly polished, his clipboard actual, his tone steady as bedrock. I met him halfway and gave a concise summary of what was happening. He nodded once, expression tightening. It didn't take long to see the difference between play enforcement and the real thing. Lewis paced to the boundary marker, map in hand, and confirmed what all of us already knew. The HOA's equipment and their ridiculous chairwoman-reserved parking sign were planted squarely on my property. The neighbors who had wandered out, Rebecca, folder in hand, and Grant, recorder clipped to his shirt while walking his golden retriever, formed a casual but undeniable jury. Everyone was about to watch the HOA's act exposed for what it was. Soon Derek walked toward us, badge hanging from his vest, clipboard tucked close. His voice blared too loud, too official, like a kid repeating lines for a school play. "Sir, you need to stop and submit to a compliance review. This area is under HOA jurisdiction. I'll need identification and documentation for any work you're doing on community grounds." Grant's chuckle carried on the breeze, and Rebecca arched her brows. And then Lewis stepped forward. "I'm Deputy Mark Lewis with the County Sheriff's Office. May I see your credentials for conducting property inspections?" His words landed like a gavel. Derek faltered. His hand hovered near his badge, then pressed against it, then dropped. I'm a certified compliance volunteer," he stammered. "Riverside Meadows HOA authorized me to oversee community safety inspections." His face paled as Lewis leaned in, examining the badge without touching it. Compared to the heavy gleam of Lewis's sheriff's star, Derek's tin clip looked like a toy from a Halloween aisle. "What agency issued this certification?" Lewis asked. "Show me documentation authorizing you to conduct warrantless inspections of private property." Derek sputtered. Malene intervened quickly, her voice strained. "Deputy, there's been a misunderstanding. Derek is simply a volunteer assisting with property management oversight." But the damage was already done. Derek had presented himself as law enforcement authority in front of actual law enforcement. Grant's recorder captured every word. Rebecca flipped open her folder, and even the other volunteer at the command table stepped back like he didn't want to be caught too close to the damage unfolding. Rebecca raised her voice, confident now. "Deputy Lewis, according to records, residents have been billed over $4,000 for these so-called compliance patrols. Patrols that were never approved. We've discovered charges for radios, strobes, and certification fees that do not exist." She held up the spreadsheets, color-coded evidence glowing in sunlight. Grant added dryly, "My dog and I have picked up their radio chatter all week. They talk about enforcement protocols, keeping suspects under watch. None of which belongs in a subdivision HOA," Lewis wrote quickly, his jaw clenched. Then he looked up at Derek. "Impersonating law enforcement is a criminal offense. Presenting yourself as having power to inspect, detain, or demand identification without actual certification violates state law." Derek looked ready to dissolve into the ground, eyes darting frantically to Malene for rescue. But Malene's expression had hardened into something else. Realization that the script was finished. Her actors trapped and the curtain falling. In that moment, under the clear midday sky, their entire project collapsed. Amber strobes looked suddenly cheap, cones out of place, reflective vests like costumes rather than uniforms. The HOA's theater of authority had been shattered by the presence of one real badge, and I knew right then that their power was finished. Not because I was louder, but because this time authority was on my side, and no clipboard could fake that. The 3-day notice period I had given the Riverside Meadows HOA expired on a Thursday morning, so clear and bright, it almost felt staged by fate. By 9 a.m., most of the neighborhood had gathered near the mailbox cluster, drawn like iron filings to a magnet by the promise of reckoning. Word had spread fast at the feed store, where Rebecca had pinned her financial breakdown with color-coded highlights for everyone to see. By the time farmers came in for dog feed and mothers for chicken scratch, the talk of the town wasn't crops or weather. It was that the HOA had burned through over $6,000 on fake patrol gear, radios, and certifications that never existed. When residents saw how their monthly dues had been funneled into reflective vests and amber strobes instead of playground repairs or landscaping, they came ready with their questions and their anger. Deputy Lewis arrived first, his truck pulling in without the fanfare of flashing lights, but his very presence grounding the scene. Rebecca showed up soon after, clutching her now famous folder of spreadsheets. Grant strolled along behind his golden retriever, recorder plainly clipped to his shirt, a man with nothing to hide and every intention of documenting history. I stood nearby, clipboard in hand, notepad thick with copies of lease agreements and county documents. Across the meadow, Malene lingered in her SUV with the motor running, eyes flicking nervously between the crowd and the road like she might speed away at any moment. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not today. When the residents finally called the meeting to order, it was nothing like the staged sessions Malene had held before. There was no head table, no gavel striking. Just neighbors, face to face under clear daylight, demanding clarity. I raised my voice first, not shouting, but steady enough to carry. For 4 years, the HOA has disguised this pump house and mailbox cluster as community property. The truth is, they were never owned by the HOA. They were leased from my Uncle Nathan and now from me. Every reserve sign they planted, every patrol they ran, has been theater built on private land. I held up a lease document, familiar county seal glinting, and while they pretended authority, they were charging you thousands for fake services. Murmurs rippled. Rebecca stepped forward next, flipping open her binder. Here's the evidence. Over $6,000 of spending in just 8 months. Invoices marked for landscaping when in truth radio units and amber strobes. Charges for patrol certifications no governing board ever approved, because those certification programs don't exist. She turned pages for the group to see. Color-coded lines, each damning, left no room for deflection. Grant spoke next, calm but pointed. I've recorded their radio chatter during daily walks. They weren't just wasting your money. They were discussing enforcement protocols, monitoring families, reporting violations like some parody of law enforcement. These weren't neighborhood watch volunteers. They were impersonating authority, and they funded it with your checks. His retriever barked lightly, almost as if punctuating the point. That was when Malene finally emerged from her vehicle. But gone was the crisp blazer and forced authority. She walked slowly toward the circle, face drawn, voice unsteady. I can explain the financial situation, she said weakly, but nobody leaned closer this time. Nobody gave her that deference she once demanded. Her words were washed away by an immediate question from the crowd. Why were we funding radios when our park swings are rusting? Another voice. Where did you hide the budgets from board oversight? A third, louder. How dare you put volunteers in vests pretending to police us? Each question hit her like a blow, and she had no defense. I stepped to the boundary marker, bent, and pulled up the infamous chairwoman reserved parking sign. Underneath, hidden all these years, was the original plate my uncle had cemented into the ground. Visitor parking only. I held it up in silence, and the weight of the truth settled on everyone. She hadn't just faked authority. She had literally covered and concealed the real designation. Even her throne had been built on borrowed ground. The gasp from the group was louder than her whispered protest. Deputy Lewis, steady as ever, made it formal. Mr. Carter has full legal authority over this land. The Compliance Patrol Program is terminated effective immediately. Any further impersonation of law enforcement will be referred for prosecution. His calm tone, his badge shining under the sun, cut through the drama like a blade. Derek stood awkwardly off to the side, his vest limp at his shoulders, fake badge tucked into his pocket. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Then Rebecca, seizing momentum, said what everyone had been waiting for. I'm calling for an emergency HOA board vote to remove Malene Pierce from all leadership roles. We will also engage outside auditors to recover unauthorized funds and determine restitution owed to residents. One by one, hands lifted in agreement. Some voices angry, some relieved, but all united in consensus. By noon, the crowd drifted back to their homes, but the stage had shifted. Once, the mailbox cluster had been the center of shadow authority. Now it was just a pad of concrete sitting on my land, carrying truths too heavy for an HOA to disguise. I gathered my documents, tucked my uncle's final handwritten note back in my pocket, his advice about theater versus authority ringing truer than ever, and returned to the cabin porch. For the first time since I'd arrived, I looked at the meadow and saw quiet without threat. The yellow tape was gone, the amber lights extinguished. The fake badges worthless. Sitting in my uncle's chair, coffee in hand, I realized the lesson was simple. Authority built on fear is nothing but theater. And theater collapses the moment someone shines real daylight on it.